At 1 o'clock in the morning, on August 7, 1944, a young American lieutenant crouched in a shallow foxhole near the summit of a rocky hill in Normandy. The night was thick with heat and fog. The air smelled of crushed grass and diesel fuel. Below him, somewhere in the darkness, tank engines rumbled. Metal clanked against metal. Treads ground slowly over stone. Men shouted to one another in German. He could not see a single vehicle. He could not count how many were coming. He could only listen. The hill was known to the French as Montjoie, the Mountain of Joy. To the American army, it had a number instead. Hill 314. 700 American soldiers had climbed to its summit only hours earlier. They had no tanks, no heavy weapons, no clear way down. What the lieutenant was hearing in the darkness below him was not a patrol. It was not a probing attack. It was the sound of an army moving, and before the sun rose, that army would try to take the hill, because as long as Hill 314 remained in American hands, an entire German offensive would fail. Most of the men on the summit did not know that yet. They only knew one thing: the enemy was coming. To understand why German tanks were moving toward that hill in the middle of the night, you have to step back, not just across France, but into the mind of one man. By early August 1944, the war in Western Europe was slipping away from Adolf Hitler. For nearly 2 months after D-Day, Allied armies had been trapped in the hedgerows of Normandy, fighting yard by yard through fields that favored the defenders. Casualties were heavy. Progress was slow. For a time, it looked as though the front might stall entirely. Then, in late July, everything changed. American forces launched a massive offensive west of St. Lo. Bombers shattered the German defensive line. Armor poured through the gaps. Within days, the German front collapsed. Units that had held firm for weeks were suddenly retreating, bypassed, or destroyed. On August 1st, American troops captured the town of Avranches. Through that narrow opening at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, General George Patton's Third Army surged into France. Columns of American vehicles streamed east and south, racing into the German rear. The breakout the Allies had waited for since D-Day was finally real. To German commanders on the ground, the situation was obvious and dire. If the Allies were not stopped quickly, entire German armies in Normandy would be surrounded and destroyed. Field commanders urged withdrawal. They argued for pulling back, shortening the line, saving what remained of their forces. Hitler refused. Only weeks earlier, he had watched the Eastern Front collapse under a massive Soviet offensive. Now the same thing was happening in the West. Retreat to him meant admitting defeat, and defeat was unacceptable. Instead, Hitler ordered a counterattack. A single desperate blow meant to cut straight through the American advance, reach the coast, and sever Patton's supply lines. If it worked, the Allied breakout could be strangled. If it failed, Germany's last armored reserves in Normandy would be spent. The attack was aimed at a quiet sector near a small French town called Mortain, and standing directly in its path was a rocky hill rising above the surrounding countryside, a hill 700 American soldiers had climbed only hours before. Hill 314 was not large. It was not fortified. It did not appear on postcards or in guidebooks, but it dominated the land around it. Rising more than 300 meters above sea level, the hill overlooked the roads that funneled through the town of Mortain, narrow, twisting routes that any attacking force would have to use if it hoped to reach the coast. From the summit, you could see for miles. You could see columns of vehicles moving along the roads. You could see tanks assembling in orchards and fields. You could see infantry forming up at crossroads and tree lines. And most importantly, you could direct artillery fire onto every one of those places. In 1944, artillery was still the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. Tanks were powerful, but vulnerable. Infantry was essential, but exposed. Artillery, when guided by trained observers, could stop an attack before it ever reached the front line. Hill 314 gave the Americans something priceless: eyes. As long as American soldiers held that summit, German forces could not move toward Avranches without being seen. And once they were seen, they could be destroyed. For the German commanders planning the counterattack, this posed a brutal problem. They could not simply bypass the hill. They could not ignore it. Every column that tried to pass beneath it risked being shattered by shellfire. The hill had to be taken. For the Americans, the equation was just as simple. If Hill 314 fell, the German attack would roll west, straight into the thin supply lines, feeding Patton's Third Army. The Allied breakout could be cut in half. Thousands of vehicles and tens of thousands of men could be trapped. 700 infantrymen, dug into rocky ground, suddenly found themselves holding a position far larger than its size suggested. They were not defending a hill. They were defending the entire Allied advance out of Normandy. And within hours, the Germans would begin trying to tear that hill from their hands. The soldiers who climbed Hill 314 on the afternoon of August 6th were not elite troops. They were not specially selected. They were simply the ones who happened to arrive first. They belonged to the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, part of the U.S. Army's 30th Infantry Division, a National Guard formation drawn largely from the American South, Tennessee, Georgia, the Carolinas. By the time they reached Mortain, they were already exhausted. They had landed in Normandy weeks earlier and fought their way through the hedgerows, a kind of combat that chewed men up slowly. Every field had been a battle, every hedgerow a potential ambush. They had watched friends die at close range. They had survived artillery, mortars, and air attacks, including bombs dropped by their own aircraft. Now they were told this assignment would be different. Mortain was supposed to be quiet. The Germans were retreating. The worst fighting, they were assured, was behind them. The men carried rifles, machine guns, a handful of mortars, and a few bazookas. They had no tanks. Their anti-tank guns were small, light weapons that could barely penetrate the armor of the German Panthers and Tigers moving toward them. What they did have were 2 forward artillery observer teams. One was led by Lieutenant Robert Weiss, a 21-year-old from Pennsylvania. He carried a heavy SCR 610 radio in a leather case, its batteries slung over his shoulders. From the hilltop, Weiss could see nearly every road the Germans would have to use. The other team included Sergeant Frank Denius, just 19 years old, already decorated for bravery in earlier fighting. He had learned quickly how to stay alive, how to call fire under pressure, how to keep a radio working when everything else failed. Company commanders spread their men along the rocky crest. Foxholes were shallow, cover was poor. There was little time to improve the defenses before night fell. As the sun went down, the soldiers settled into position. Some tried to sleep, others listened. They believed they were holding a quiet hill on a collapsing front. They were wrong. The German attack began shortly after midnight. There was no artillery preparation, no warning barrage, no slow buildup. German armored columns moved through the darkness, pushing straight past American positions in and around Mortain. Infantry followed close behind the tanks, using the narrow Norman roads and hedgerows to stay concealed. American roadblocks were hit first. Anti-tank guns fired at point-blank range, their shells striking German armor and bouncing away uselessly. Bazooka teams crept forward through smoke and confusion, firing from close range, sometimes close enough to feel the heat of the engines. It was not enough. Within hours, German forces were inside Mortain itself. The battalion headquarters was overrun. Officers and radio operators were killed or captured. Maps and equipment fell into German hands. On Hill 314, the men could hear the fighting below them. Gunfire echoed up from the town. Explosions flashed through the fog. The sounds came closer, then moved away. One by one, the radio lines went silent. Messages sent down the hill went unanswered. Runners never returned. The men on the summit began to understand what was happening, not all at once, but in fragments. They had not been reinforced. They had been bypassed. German tanks and infantry flowed around the hill, cutting it off from every direction. Roads that had been friendly only hours earlier were now controlled by the enemy. By the time the sky began to lighten before dawn, Hill 314 was surrounded. 700 American soldiers were isolated on a rocky summit encircled by German armor and infantry. They still held the high ground, but now there was no clear way off it. The first German probes came before sunrise. Infantry moved up the slopes in the half-light, spreading out through rocks and trees, feeling for the American line. They advanced cautiously at first, expecting resistance, but not expecting what followed. From the summit, the Americans could hear them coming long before they could see them. Boots on stone, voices carried uphill, metal scraped against rock. Lieutenant Robert Weiss lay beside his radio, listening intently, turning sound into distance, distance into coordinates. He could not see targets clearly through the fog, but he knew where the roads ran, where the tree lines met the fields, where troops would naturally gather before an attack. He began calling for fire. The first artillery rounds fell short, then closer, then exactly where they needed to be. Shells exploded among the German infantry as they climbed, tearing through formations that had barely begun their assault. Men scattered for cover. Attacks stalled before they could reach the American foxholes. German commanders adjusted. They brought tanks forward. Armored vehicles moved along the roads below the hill, engines roaring, turrets swinging toward the summit. The Americans watched muzzle flashes bloom in the fog as tank guns fired uphill. Rounds slammed into the rocky crest, blasting stone and dirt into the air. American soldiers pressed themselves into shallow foxholes, helmets rattling as explosions walked across the hilltop. Again, Weiss called for fire. This time the artillery fell dangerously close, too close for comfort. Shells burst just beyond the American perimeter, shrapnel hissing through the trees. One mistake would have meant disaster. But the calculations were right. German tanks were hit as they maneuvered below the hill. Infantry caught in the open was torn apart. The attack broke down into chaos. By mid-morning, the first assault had failed. The Germans withdrew to reorganize, leaving their dead and wounded scattered along the slopes. On the summit, the Americans checked weapons, redistributed ammunition, and treated the wounded as best they could. No one believed it was over. They had stopped the first blow. But everyone understood the truth. The enemy now knew exactly where they were, and the next attack would be stronger. As the morning wore on, a grim rhythm settled over Hill 314. German units would assemble below the slopes, out of sight, gathering in orchards, farmyards, and road junctions. Tanks would idle under tree cover, infantry would bunch together, waiting for orders, and then the radios on the summit would come alive. Lieutenant Weiss and the other forward observers no longer waited for attacks to begin. From the hilltop, they could see the movement that preceded them. Shadows shifting along roads, columns pausing too long at intersections, clusters of men forming where no one lingered by accident. Each movement was turned into numbers. Each number was turned into a fire mission. The artillery supporting Hill 314 fired almost continuously. Batteries miles away responded within seconds, sending 105mm shells screaming overhead. The ground below the hill erupted again and again as shells walked across roads and fields, smashing vehicles, scattering infantry, forcing German units to break apart before they ever reached the slopes. For the men on the hill, the sound became constant, the whistle of incoming rounds, the dull concussion of explosions, the rattle of debris falling back to earth. It was terrifying, and it was life-saving. Artillery was now the hill's heartbeat. As long as the guns kept firing, the defenders could survive. If the radios failed, if the batteries died, Hill 314 would be reduced to rifle fire and courage alone. The Germans began to understand this as well. Reports filtered up their chain of command, describing an enemy that seemed to see everything. Attacks were broken apart before they formed. Columns were struck the moment they paused. Movement in daylight became almost impossible. German artillery answered in kind. Heavy guns opened fire on the summit. Shells screamed in from long range, exploding among the rocks and trees. White phosphorus rounds burst overhead, spraying burning fragments that clung to uniforms and skin. Smoke drifted across the crest, choking the air and blinding the defenders. Several rounds landed near Weiss's position, close enough to tear stone from the ground and snap branches overhead. One shell clipped the antenna of his radio, bending it sharply. The radio still worked. As long as it did, the hill would hold. By early afternoon, it was clear that this was no temporary skirmish. The Germans were not probing anymore. They were committing themselves to taking Hill 314, no matter the cost. By the end of the first day, the pattern was set. The Germans attacked at dawn and again at dusk, timing their assaults for the moments when light was weakest and observation most difficult. Each time, infantry moved first, climbing the slopes in loose formations, using fog and smoke to close the distance. Tanks followed behind them, guns elevated, firing blindly toward the crest. Each time, the Americans answered with artillery. At first light, shells tore into German assembly areas as the attackers formed up. At sunset, fire missions slammed into the slopes just as infantry began moving uphill. The timing became almost ritualistic. Attack, barrage, withdrawal, repeated again and again. The ground around Hill 314 began to change. Trees were shredded into splinters, rocks cracked and tumbled down the slopes. Foxholes collapsed under the weight of near misses. Men lived pressed against the earth, their bodies molded into shallow holes scraped from stone. Helmets rang constantly from concussion. Dirt and fragments filled mouths and eyes. Sleep came only in short, uneasy stretches, broken by explosions and shouted warnings. German artillery joined the assault relentlessly. 88mm guns fired directly at the summit, their shells shrieking in before detonating among the rocks. Mortar rounds dropped without warning, bursting overhead and showering the defenders with jagged fragments. White phosphorus ignited brush and trees, setting parts of the hill ablaze and filling the air with acrid smoke. The wounded began to accumulate. Men were hit while carrying ammunition, hit while trying to reinforce a foxhole, hit while lying still, doing nothing more than surviving. There was no way to evacuate them. Medics worked where they could, using dwindling supplies, tearing bandages into strips, administering morphine sparingly. Some wounds could be treated, others could not. As daylight faded and darkness returned, the firing would slow. For a short time, the hill would grow quiet. Men checked their weapons, counted their remaining ammunition, whispered to one another. Some prayed. Others simply stared into the dark, waiting for the sound of engines to rise again from below. Because they knew what dawn would bring. Another attack, another barrage, another climb through smoke and fire. On Hill 314, time began to lose its meaning. There was only dawn and dusk and the repetition of death. Late on the afternoon of August 7th, a new sound rolled across the battlefield. Above the fog and smoke, engines roared, deeper, steadier, unmistakably Allied. American P-47 Thunderbolts appeared first, heavy fighters diving low over the countryside. Moments later, British Typhoons followed, their wings bristling with rockets. They swept down on German columns stalled on the roads below Mortain. From the summit of Hill 314, the defenders watched as vehicles exploded in flashes of fire and smoke. Rockets tore through armored columns, bombs slammed into intersections and road junctions already cratered by artillery fire. For the German soldiers below, it was devastating. Movement in daylight became nearly impossible. Tanks were abandoned by their crews, even when they had not been hit. Convoys backed up along narrow roads, blocked by burning wrecks. Officers struggled to regroup units that were pinned in place by constant air attack. To the men on the hill, the sight brought a brief surge of hope. The enemy was being punished. The attack was being slowed. The pressure below them was easing. But the help did not reach the summit. The aircraft could not see the foxholes among the rocks. They could not drop food, water, or ammunition where the Americans needed it. German anti-aircraft fire drove off light planes that tried to resupply the hill. Parachuted bundles drifted into enemy-held ground, tantalizingly close but unreachable. The air war was being won below Hill 314. On the summit, the situation remained unchanged. The men were still surrounded. They were still running out of ammunition. They were still thirsty, exhausted, and wounded. The thunder of aircraft faded into the distance. And once again, the hill was left to face the next attack alone. By the third day, the fighting was no longer the greatest threat on Hill 314. It was everything else. Ammunition was nearly gone. Boxes had been shattered by shell fire. Men passed clips and grenades hand to hand, counting every round. When a soldier was killed, his weapons were quietly collected and redistributed to the living. Food disappeared quickly. There were no hot meals, no resupply trucks. Whatever the men carried up the hill had to last. Hunger set in first as a dull ache, then as a constant distraction that gnawed at concentration and patience. Water became the most precious thing on the hill. The heat was relentless. Sweat-soaked uniforms and dried into salt. Canteens emptied within hours. Some men risked their lives crawling downslope to reach a well marked on maps before the battle began. Others drank from shell craters, muddy pools streaked with oil and blood, knowing it might make them sick, but knowing dehydration would kill them faster. The wounded suffered worst of all. There were no stretchers, no evacuation. Men lay where they fell, treated in foxholes with whatever bandages remained. Morphine was rationed carefully. Some soldiers begged for water, some whispered for help, some said nothing at all. The dead could not be buried. Bodies were dragged behind rocks or into shallow depressions, covered as best as possible. In the August heat, decay came quickly. The smell spread across the summit, clinging to uniforms and skin, impossible to escape. It settled into the minds of the defenders as heavily as the smoke and dust. French civilians from nearby farms tried to help. Under cover of darkness, they carried bread and vegetables up the slopes, slipping through German lines at the risk of execution. It was an act of quiet courage, born of occupation and gratitude, but it was never enough for hundreds of starving men. By now, the siege had stripped the fight down to its simplest truth. There were no reserves. There was no relief in sight. There were only men who could still stand, and those who could not, clinging to a rocky hilltop, waiting to see which group they would soon join. On the evening of August 9th, as the light began to fade once again, something unexpected happened. A lone figure emerged from below the hill. He walked uphill slowly, deliberately, holding a white flag above his head. The firing stopped. American soldiers watched from their foxholes as the man approached. He was a German officer, immaculately dressed despite days of fighting. His uniform was clean, his posture calm. When he spoke, his English was precise and confident. He told the Americans their situation was hopeless. Their battalion headquarters had been destroyed, he said. German forces controlled the surrounding countryside. There would be no relief. Continued resistance would only lead to unnecessary death. Then he made his offer. If the Americans surrendered now, they would be treated honorably. They would receive food and water. Their wounded would receive medical care. The fighting could end. If they refused, he warned, the hill would be obliterated. They had 90 minutes to decide. The message was carried to Lieutenant Ralph Curley, one of the senior officers still alive on the summit. He listened without interruption. He was filthy, exhausted, and running on little more than determination. Around him lay wounded men who had gone days without proper care. Some of them could hear the conversation. From nearby foxholes, voices rose up, weak, hoarse, but unmistakable. No surrender. Don't give up. Men who could barely move, men who might not survive the night, shouted their refusal. Curley did not hesitate. He sent the German officer back down the hill with a reply so short and so blunt that it was never written down in official reports. Those who heard it later said it was unprintable, but its meaning was perfectly clear. There would be no surrender. 15 minutes after the deadline expired, German artillery opened fire. Flares burst overhead. Tracers cut through the darkness. Infantry began moving uphill once more. The most violent attack of the siege had begun, and Hill 314 would either fall that night or it would never fall at all. The final German assault came in darkness. Artillery fell first, heavier and more concentrated than before. Shells detonated across the summit in rapid succession, tearing open foxholes, shattering what little cover remained. Flares burst overhead, flooding the hilltop with harsh white light and exposing every rock, every position, every moving figure. German infantry followed close behind the barrage. They climbed the slopes shouting, firing as they came, hurling grenades into foxholes and gaps in the American line. In several places they broke through, forcing hand-to-hand fighting among the rocks. Rifles were fired at point-blank range. Pistols emptied their magazines. Men fought with bayonets, helmets, and bare hands. The defenders were nearly spent. Ammunition was down to the last clips. Some soldiers fired their final rounds and fixed bayonets, bracing themselves for what came next. Radios crackled weakly as their batteries faded. Each transmission was shorter than the last. Every word weighed against the knowledge that silence would mean the end. Still, the artillery answered. Shells fell so close that fragments sprayed across American positions. Rocks and dirt rained down from the blasts. Men pressed their faces into the ground and waited for the explosions to move just a few yards farther away, far enough to kill the enemy without killing them. Slowly, The German attack began to lose momentum. Units that had advanced confidently only hours earlier were now disorganized, exhausted, and under constant fire. Officers were killed or wounded. Communications broke down. Attacking formations dissolved into small groups pinned in place by artillery and small arms fire. Just before dawn, the firing slackened. German survivors pulled back down the slopes, leaving the ground littered with bodies and shattered equipment. On the summit, the Americans remained where they were, too tired to cheer, too depleted to celebrate. They had reached the limits of endurance. Many had no ammunition left. Some could no longer stand. All of them knew that if the Germans attacked again, there would be nothing left to stop them. But as the sky began to lighten over Normandy, a quiet truth settled over Hill 314. The enemy had reached his breaking point too, and this time, he was the one who could not go on. Just before dawn on August 12th, the sounds around Hill 314 began to change. The tank engines faded into the distance. Artillery fire slackened, then stopped altogether. For the first time in days, the hilltop was quiet. At first, no one trusted it. The survivors stayed in their foxholes, weapons ready, waiting for the next barrage that did not come. Minutes passed, then more. Slowly, cautiously, men began to lift their heads and look downslope. German forces were withdrawing. Later that morning, American infantry began climbing toward the summit. Soldiers from neighboring units moved carefully through the shattered terrain, unsure of what they would find. What they encountered stopped them in their tracks. The hill was a ruin. Bodies lay among the rocks, American and German alike, some fallen where they had fought at arm's length. Trees were splintered stumps, foxholes, were crushed and half filled with earth and debris. The ground was pocked with craters, blackened by fire and explosives. The wounded were still there. Men who had survived nearly a week without proper food, water, or medical care lay weak and dehydrated in their positions, some barely able to speak. Others had held on through sheer will alone, refusing to die before help arrived. Of the 700 men who had climbed Hill 314, fewer than 400 could walk down under their own power. Those who did moved in silence. They were filthy, hollow-eyed, and exhausted beyond expression. Some wept openly. Others stared straight ahead, unable to process what they had endured. Behind them, Hill 314 stood quiet at last. It had not fallen. And because it had not fallen, something far larger than a single hill had been decided. The defense of Hill 314 did more than save the men who survived it. It broke the German counterattack in Normandy. Hitler's offensive, meant to cut through Mortain, reach the coast, and sever Patton's supply lines, collapsed without achieving its objective. German armored divisions burned fuel, lost tanks, and bled infantry trying to take a single hill they could not afford to fight for. While German forces were locked in place around Mortain, the rest of the Allied armies kept moving. Patton's Third Army continued driving east and south, pouring through the gap at Avranches. To the north, British and Canadian forces pressed downward. German units that should have been disengaging were instead pulled west into a failing attack, stretching their lines thinner with every hour. Within days, the German armies in Normandy were trapped. The collapse around Mortain helped open the way to what became the Falaise Pocket, a massive encirclement that shattered the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. Hundreds of tanks and vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. The German army in France never recovered. Paris would be liberated less than 2 weeks later. By the end of August, what remained of German forces had been driven back across the Seine. The road toward Germany lay open. None of that was decided in a headquarters tent or on a map. It was decided in part on a rocky hill in Normandy, where 700 exhausted infantrymen held their ground for 6 days and refused to let an army pass. After Hill 314, the war did not pause. The men who survived the siege were treated, reorganized, and sent back into the fighting. Some would cross France with Patton's Third Army. Others would fight in the Battle of the Bulge. Many would cross the Rhine and see Germany itself before the war finally ended. Some would not live to see peace. Lieutenant Robert Weiss continued serving as a forward artillery observer through the rest of the war. Decades later, he would return to Hill 314, standing once again at the spot where he had called in. Fire as a 21-year-old, listening to the wind move through trees that had not existed in 1944. Sergeant Frank Denius went on to become one of the most decorated American soldiers of the European War. In his later years, France awarded him the Legion of Honor, a quiet acknowledgement from a country that never forgot who had helped free it. For a long time, the defense of Hill 314 received little attention outside military histories. There were no sweeping offensives, no dramatic breakthroughs, no famous speeches tied to its name. It was simply a battalion ordered to hold ground, and doing so at a cost most people would never see. Only decades later did formal recognition come. In 2020, the United States Army awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to the 30th Infantry Division for its actions at Mortain, acknowledging, at last, the extraordinary heroism of men who had fought without hope of relief, without adequate supplies, and without any promise that their stand would ever be remembered. Today, Hill 314 is quiet. The rocky slopes are shaded by trees. Foxholes remain as shallow scars in the earth. A small chapel and memorial stand near the summit, overlooking the same roads German armor once tried to use. Visitors walk where soldiers once crawled. They stand where radios once crackled with fire missions. They look out over the countryside and see nothing moving at all. That silence is the legacy of Hill 314. Wars are often described through generals and grand strategy, through arrows on maps and decisions made far from the front. But sometimes history turns for a simpler reason, because a group of exhausted men refused to surrender a piece of ground, because they endured when retreat would have been easier, because, for 6 days in August 1944, they held a hill, and by holding it, helped change the course of a war. If you found this story worth remembering, we invite you to share your thoughts below. These moments only endure, because people continue to pass them on. Thank you for listening.